Alright, welcome to the CSS Essential Training Series. I'm Mike King, your instructor for this tutorial. And this tutorial is on styling elements using external style sheets. This is part 3 of our 3-part series on how we can actually style our HTML pages. So styling elements using external style sheets. So in part 3 of our styling series, we're going to look at using an external style sheet to style our HTML document. The external style sheet is the preferred method to style our HTML elements as we progress in our learning of website design. This is the best way to put styles on our web pages. There are many advantages to using external style sheets. An external style sheet is a separate file that your web page is linked to in the head element of the web page that normally contains all the styles for that web page. One external style sheet can style thousands of pages of your website. Thus, you can gain a tremendous consistency by using external style sheets as we style our web pages. By adding class and ID attributes to our HTML document elements, you can style individual elements consistently across many different pages of the website. The link elements used to attach an external style sheet to your web page, and numerous link elements can be used on the HTML document. And that's one of the things you're going to see me demonstrate as we go through our tutorials. I actually try to keep my style sheets relatively small, so as I get to particular areas of the website that are going to be styled slightly differently than the base styling, I actually develop a style sheet just for those styles, and I'll load that style sheet when those pages load. An external style sheet is ideal when the styles you're applying to the web page are applied to many different pages. By using an external style sheet, we can change the look of an entire website by merely changing the style sheet in that external style page. Each page must link to the style sheet using the link element, and we're going to demonstrate that in a minute. And the link element will always fall inside the head section of our web page. Cascading style sheets are created using a text editor and end with a .css extension. There are many advantages to using external style sheets, and the advantages far outweigh the disadvantages. But, as with all development tools, there are some disadvantages to using an external style sheet. We're going to look at a couple of those now. So, things to consider when you're designing your external style sheets. External style sheets can increase the download time of the pages. We want to try to keep things consistent, but we also want to try to keep these files relatively small. Now, keep in mind, I'm talking about huge style sheet files that will actually slow down load time. If these are a few hundred lines, it's not a problem at all. You're not even going to notice it with today's internet connection speeds. It won't even be a consideration. But when they get into tens of thousands, which they can actually slow down, slightly degrade the load time of your website. You have to wait for the entire sheet to load before the page will be displayed. Obviously, because the styles are linking to that page, that entire sheet will have to load, even if there's hundreds of lines that don't pertain to that particular web page. And external style sheets can get very big very quickly, and it can become hard to tell when styles are no longer needed across the page because they may have been deleted, the pages may have been removed, that style may have been changed. So when you're designing your style sheets, you want to stay organized, keep things broken into sections, as we'll demonstrate as we do the style sheets for these tutorials. And this way, as you change things on the website, you'll know what areas of the style sheet to go to update. Linking your style sheets. Here's an example of a link. You have a relationship attribute, a type attribute, and an href attribute. And by the way, you'll notice that this is a CSS or an HTML5 link. You'll notice we don't have the closing brace at the end. Those are no longer required in HTML5. And our relationship attribute specifies the relationship between the current document and the link document. And in this case, you'll see that our relationship is a style sheet. The type specifies the type of document. In this case, it's a text/CSS because it's a plain text file, but it's a CSS file that's going to refer to in this particular document. And then the href specifies the URL of the page the link goes to. There are many variations of href depending upon what we're actually linking to, and as we go through these tutorial series, you're going to see that we have many different ways that we can put href, the attribute href, into our HTML elements. So keep in mind there's many different ways that we can actually do this. The way that we're demonstrating is an absolute URL which goes to a directory path for this particular base.css file. Okay, so let's move into our development environment and let's demonstrate the things we've talked about in the short presentation so that you can see how we actually set up and link an external style sheet to our HTML document. Alright, so as we do with all our tutorials, let's go ahead and confirm that our environment is set up and ready to go for our demonstrations. I'm going to go ahead and minimize my presentation. First thing I want to do, let's go ahead and check the directory structure in the web root. This is in the web root of our web server or development server. I've got a _CSS folder and an _images folder. This will be where I actually store the files for this particular tutorial demonstration. And in this demonstration, we're actually going to use that _CSS folder as we're going to go ahead and store our external file in that directory. Next thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and confirm that we've got our Apache web server up and running. So you should have your green lights on your XAMPP server up and ready to go, both with your Apache and your MySQL. We won't be using MySQL or PHP in this tutorial, but again, I always have them running in my demonstrations. I want to go ahead and load up my test browser that I'm going to use. In this particular demonstration, I'm going to use the Firefox test browser, and I'm actually in the web root of my directory. And I want to bring up my text editor. I'm going to be using Sublime Text 2 for this tutorial. And the next thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and load our basic HTML document that we're going to use for this tutorial. So in my exercise file, I'm going to go grab example 1. If you have access to the exercise files, let's go ahead and paste that in our text editor. I want to do a save as. And I want to make certain I'm saving it now in the web root of my web server. So I'm going to go down to my web development server, my www directory, inside my tutorials. And I want to save this as basic template, as we always do, .html. I'm going to save that in my web root. Let's go ahead and refresh that browser window, and you'll see that basic template come up inside your browser window. You can actually load that now into the browser so you can see what we're looking at. Let me go ahead and set up the formatting for this document, and then you can go ahead. I'll stop so that you all can type this in. I still have not quite figured out why it doesn't bring my formatting over correctly, because when I'm doing the setup, it's there. For some reason, it just doesn't come over from my text editor into this document correctly. So I'm just going to pull out these additional spaces. Again, it doesn't make a difference. It would still display correctly, as is obvious, because you can see it displayed. I just want to pull out the extra spaces so it's easier to follow what we're doing. Alright, let me go ahead and save that document. Now would be a great time. I'm scroll to the top. Let me make sure my word wrap is on. Now would be a great time if you need to pause the video to type this in. Go ahead and scroll down so you get the remainder of the document. Again, would be a good time to pause the video if you need to get this copied into your text editor. Alright, we've got our file up and we've got it saved. We've confirmed that our environment's operational. We've got our text editor loaded. I'm going to go ahead and do a save as. Let's go ahead and save this. Again, the reason I'm doing this is so that you can have all this stuff for you in the event you have the exercise files. Chapter _17. Chapter 17, I'm sorry, _02.html. Let's go ahead and save that file. And now in the next demonstration, we're going to go ahead and set up our actual base CSS. So in your text editor, let's go ahead and create a new file. And that new file, I want you to go ahead and save that, do a save as. I want you to save it in your CSS, your _CSS directory, and call it base.css. And if you remember, that is this file that we've got referenced right here. You'll actually see our link, as we just discussed in the presentation, that takes us over to that base.css file. That's the file that we're going to be working with as our external document. The only difference you'll notice here is I'm using this $v equal, and I use that as a version tracking for my CSS files. It's a habit I've gotten into a long time ago, because as your websites get larger and larger, you'll have multiple versions of different files and folders. So I tend to put version numbers on things so I know as I'm testing what version of the actual package I'm testing with. Alright, so in the next demonstration, we're going to go in and start setting up our actual CSS file so that we can change the formatting of our web page. Alright, so we've got our base CSS file created. Let's go ahead and put in our first couple of styles. Go ahead and do things. I'm going to go ahead and select that base.css file. The first thing I want to do is something we had done in one of the earlier tutorials in HTML. We had actually done a CSS reset to go and reset all the margins and paddings inside of our file. We're going to go ahead and make that part of our base CSS file, since this will be the file that we're going to start building on as we build this website throughout the tutorials. So we're going to go ahead and create our CSS Reset. I'm going to use my universal selector, which is my star symbol. By the way, I would normally have notes up in this section. My comment is a /star, and I'd have information like CSS File for tutorial website. I'd actually put notes up in this section of the CS document so I knew what was going on here. A lot of times I'll put in the title of the website, I'll put in the date, stuff like that, just so you know what this base CSS file pertains to. So the first thing I'm going to do, universal selector, my opening curly brace, my closing curly brace. I'm just going to go ahead and set my margins at 0. And if you're using a good text editor, it'll help you finish filling these out, because as you begin to type, it will fill it out. My padding is also going to be at 0. So I've got 0 pixels of margin, 0 pixels of padding. I'm going to go ahead and save this file. We're just saving it into our base.css file in the CSS directory. Remember, our 1702 document's already linked to that file. I'm going to go ahead back to my website. Let's go ahead and restore and load that 1702 file, and you'll notice now we've taken out the margins and padding from that document based on the universal reset that we've just done inside of our document. Next thing I want to do, as we did in our previous tutorial when we were demonstrating the style elements inside of HTML, I'm going to go ahead and set my HTML element. So I'm going to put my HTML in there, opening curly brace, closing curly brace. I'm going to give it a width, and the width is going to be 100%, and that with a semicolon. And I'm going to go ahead and give it a background color of a light gray. So I'm going to use my pound symbol, CCC, and that with a semicolon. Go ahead and save that change. Go ahead and refresh our document. And now you'll see we've got the light gray with our black text, and we've set the background color and the width of our HTML element. And if you remember from our previous tutorial when we actually talked about the style element, that's the root element of our document. The HTML element is the first element inside of our document. It's the root element of the document. So we've actually started to make our first set of changes to that HTML page. Alright, so continuing right along, and you notice I've done this in an order. I've started out with the universal selector for my resets, then I went to my HTML element, so it's kind of like the document flow. I'm setting up my CSS file similar to the document flow of my HTML document. The first thing I've done is my reset, then I've moved into my HTML element, which in the document flow is the very next thing up. Now I'm going to move into the body tag. Remember, the head section is not displayed inside of our browser window, and it's more for information about the document itself. So following the normal document flow, the next thing that I would actually style would be the body tag. So I'm going to go back to my CSS document. I'm going to go ahead and put my body element or my body selector inside my CSS file. First thing I want to do is give it a width, and like we did in the previous tutorial, I'm going to give it a width of 80%. After that, I want to give it a background color. And again, just as we did in our styling element tutorial, I'm going to give it a background color of white, which is FFF. That's the hexadecimal equivalent of white. I want to assign a font family to this. So my font family is going to be Arial, comma, Helvetica, and then sans serif. Put my semicolon there. I want to give it a font size of 0.8 em. I know, again, we haven't gone over the measurements yet, but we're going to cover those in a future CSS tutorial about these different types of measurements we have. I want to give the font a color of 1C5C78. For anyone that's not familiar, that's the base color of my website. I actually like that color. It's the base color you'll find on the OnTarget HTML5 website. And then, doing as we had done earlier, I want to go ahead and give it a margin right and left of auto so it centers itself inside that HTML element. So I'm going to give it a margin right of auto. And I want to give it a margin left of auto. I want to go ahead and end those with a semicolon. I want to save those changes. And if you'll go and refresh your browser window, you'll notice now that we've got a different color for our text. Our text has actually become a little bit smaller, because keep in mind the cascade in the name cascading style sheets, everything flows down. So by making the font size .8 em in the body element, it's impacted all the font sizes that fall under that. And that now becomes, this 0.8em now becomes the new 100% font size for our document. And as we style each other element based on that base reference, that 0.8em base reference, that's now all relative to that size. And that's why you noticed even our heading sizes changed, all the different sizes on our fonts changed. The color changed based on our new color selection. And now the next thing we're going to do in this portion of the tutorial, again working with these external style sheets, we're going to go ahead and style our first H1 element. So I'm going to grab the H1 element tag. I'm going to come down here, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give it a line height. And if you remember, we actually demonstrated this earlier. This actually tells us how high the line is itself that's going to contain that H1 element. So I'm giving it a line height of 1.8em, and again, that's based on the reference of 100% for the M size of that particular font, the Arial font that we're displaying in. I want to give it a background color. And my background color for this one is going to be #36C. I want to go ahead and give it a vertical alignment of center, which is going to align this text center in that particular block element. I want to give it a padding left of 25 pixels. Padding left of 25 pixels, so we're going to move it 25 pixels from the left edge of the block element, and I want to give the text a color of white. Remember, we gave the background color here 36C, which if I remember right, it's a very dark blue. Now we're going to give the text a color of white so it stands out against that new background element. I want to go ahead and save those changes. I want to go ahead and refresh our browser window, and now you'll see that we've actually styled the first heading 1 tag, or the heading 1 tags in our HTML element. Remember, we have two of those. We have two H1 tags. We actually have an H1 tag in section 1, which styling elements in HTML, external style sheets part 3, which is right here you're looking at. And then we have an H1 tag in section 2, which is styling elements using CSS in an external style sheet, and that's the one that you're seeing down here. So by setting up the styling of the H1 in my external style sheet, now I've actually referenced two separate elements on my web page, and you're beginning to see the advantages of using external style sheets, because instead of going in and getting very particular about paragraphs or individual headings, we can style groups of headings or groups of paragraphs, or in the case of the body, we style the entire web page by setting up the styles in that particular element. Alright, so as you can see, I think you're beginning to see some of the advantages of using the external style sheets in HTML, because now we can style groups of elements. It's easy to change things. We could actually reference this to another page, which we're going to do in a minute, and it would assume all that same styling as the previous page. But one thing I do want to do is I want to demonstrate how we use classes inside of CSS. And the reason being is you'll notice in my HTML document I've got two H1 tags. Now I didn't want to style both those tags the same way based on the styling that I applied, but the style sheet, because I styled H1, it applied the styling to both the H1 tags inside the HTML document. So what I want to do is I want to use an ID inside this example to style just the heading tag at the H1 tag for the top of that sheet. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give that a class equal title. So I'm going to assign it a class of title, so I can actually get specific about that particular tag. So what I want to do in my CSS document, we talked a little bit about this as we were talking about specificity in the beginning of the 3-part series, that you can become very specific as you target things in CSS. So what I want to do is I'm going to change some of these settings, and remember, we gave this H1 tag that we're looking to target now, we gave it a class of title. I want to go back to my CSS document. I want to change some things that we put in here. First off, I want to hit H1 tags to have a class of title. And I do that by putting a dot title. So that tells me an H1 tag that actually resides with a class of title inside my document. And now I want to change a few things on here so that you know that we've made a difference. I want to make my line height 2.5em because I actually want it to be a little bit taller. I'm going to leave my background color the way it is. I do want my text vertically centered inside that block element. I'm going to change my padding to 10 pixels off the side. But I actually want to add a font size to this. I'm going to add font size because I want it all to appear on one line of 0.9em. And I'm using 0.9em for a reason. If you remember correctly, I told you that everything now is relative to this particular font size that we gave the body. 0.8 is the new 100% for our body text. If I make this 0.9, it's going to be 90% of that 0.8. Remember, this is all inherited. My H1 is inherited all the sizes that are part of the body element because H1 is nested inside the body element. So if I save those changes and I update this browser window, oops, I got to save all the changes. That includes the changes to my HTML document, because remember we gave it a class of title, and I put those new title attributes, or the new title styling, inside the base.css file. You'll see now that we've only styled the one H1 element because of that class of title. We've centered our text, as we said, the vertical line, we centered it inside of our block element. We've given it a dark blue background, the font size of 0.9 ems, which is 90% of what they were originally. And we gave it a background color of dark blue with a white font. So you can see we can get very specific inside of our CSS files, inside of our targeting. What I want to do before we close out the tutorial, I want to show you how easy it is now to create an additional page and tie all these styles to that page. Alright, so the true power of external style sheets is actually linking hundreds of pages or thousands of pages to a particular style sheet so that your website can assume all the core styles based on one individual style sheet. So what I want to do is let's go to our chapter 17_02. I want to do a save as here. And I want to save this as chapter 17_03.html. I want to save that inside my document. And I also want to go ahead and remove, let's just comment out the relationship or the reference to our style sheet. And you can do that by using your less than sign, exclamation point, 2 dashes, and then ending it with dash dash greater than sign, and that will comment out so that it's no longer part of that 1703 sheet. Let's go ahead and save all our changes. I want to go back to my web root, refresh it, and load up that 17_03 sheet, and you'll notice we don't have any styles now that are associated with that particular style sheet, or with that particular web page. To bring the styles in, we would just link a document, just like we did in the previous exercise. And for this one, I'm just going to go ahead and remove the comments that we made inside of our HTML 17_03 document. Just remove those comment marks. So we're now linking to that style sheet. Save that change and refresh the page, and it will now assume all the styling from the previous sheet. So 1703 and 1702. If you go back and reload 1702, they're all loaded, or they're all referencing that particular style sheet, and they have those same styles. If I wanted to make 1703 slightly different, let's go ahead and bring 1703 back up. Inside my text editor, go ahead and remove the class of title from that H1 tag, save that change, and you're going to assume all the styles now in your base CSS, except you won't have the title style because it's no longer referenced in that individual sheet. So when you refresh chapter 17_03, you'll maintain all your body stylings that you had in the previous examples, but you lose the title styling because you took out the reference to that class of title. And that's how we can get very specific as to what we're doing on individual sheets. If we go back and you reload 02, you'll see you still got the title attribute there because it still has a class of title and it still uses that title styling based on our base.css file. So there are a ton of advantages to using external style sheets. You're going to learn more and more about these. This was just a very high-level overview of how they work, what we do with them. You're going to learn a ton as you go through this tutorial series on CSS. But now you understand the differences between inline styling, using the style element in HTML, and using external style sheets in HTML. So you know the 3 different ways that we can style a document, and you know the advantages and disadvantages of all those individual ways. So I hope you enjoyed the tutorial, and I look forward to seeing you in the next group of tutorials. So we've moved out of our development environment, and this concludes styling elements using external style sheets with CSS. I hope you learned a lot from this high-level overview of how we use external style sheets in CSS. You're going to learn much more as we go through the rest of the tutorial series, but now you have an understanding now of the 3 different methods that we use to style our HTML documents using CSS. We've talked about the inline styles, We looked at how we use the style element in HTML, and we wrapped that up with using external style sheets for CSS in HTML. And I hope you enjoyed the tutorials, and I do look forward to seeing you in the next group.